Picture this. An empire that ruled for over 2,000 years when you combine kingdom, republic, and both halves of the empire. They gave us roads that still exist today, aqueducts that engineers study in awe, legal systems that form the foundation of Western law, languages that evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Behind every marble statue, every triumphant arch, every perfectly engineered road was a civilization so brutal, so bizarre, so absolutely unhinged that if ancient Rome existed today, it would be cancelled, sanctioned, and probably investigated by the United Nations within 24 hours. This isn't the Rome of Hollywood movies with clean togas and philosophical debates. This is the Rome where drinking gladiator blood was medicine, where emperors made horses senators to insult politicians, where people vomited deliberately so they could eat more at dinner parties, where urine was big business and human torches lit garden parties. Today, you're getting the uncensored, unfiltered, absolutely insane truth about ancient Rome. No boring textbook voice. No sugarcoating. Just 15 jaw-dropping facts that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Some of these will make you laugh. Some will disturb you. All of them are 100% historically verified. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Rome was simultaneously the most advanced and most savage civilization in human history. So, buckle up, turn off your phone, and prepare to have your mind completely blown. Let's dive in. You've heard of the vomitorium myth, right? The idea that Romans had special rooms where they'd go throw up during feasts? That's actually not true. The word vomitorium referred to the passageways in amphitheaters where crowds would spew out after events. But here's the truth that's somehow even worse. Wealthy Romans absolutely did vomit during banquets, deliberately, multiple times. And they had techniques perfected over generations. They would use a feather, typically from a peacock or ostrich, or sometimes a long, thin porcupine quill. They'd tickle the back of their throat, induce vomiting, then head right back to the dining couch for the next course. Why? Because Roman banquets weren't just meals. They were endurance competitions, status symbols, tests of wealth and excess. A proper Roman feast could have 7, 9, sometimes 12 courses. These events lasted 8 to 10 hours. Sometimes longer. The Roman poet Petronius wrote an entire satirical novel called the Satyricon that describes these feasts in excruciating detail. Guests would recline on couches arranged in a U-shape around the table. Slaves would bring course after course. Flamingo tongues, considered the ultimate delicacy because it took dozens of flamingos to make one dish. Dormice, bred specifically for eating, dipped in honey and poppy seeds. Sow's womb, sometimes stuffed with live thrush birds that would fly out when carved. Peacock brains, ostrich, entire roasted boar with live piglets sewn inside. The goal wasn't just to eat, it was to demonstrate that you could afford to waste food, that you had so much wealth, you could gorge yourself, purge, and do it all over again. And here's the kicker. Archaeologists have found the evidence. When Pompeii was excavated, they discovered actual vomit stains preserved in the volcanic ash in the corners of dining rooms in wealthy villas. Chemical analysis confirmed it. These weren't accidents. These were designated vomiting spots. Some Roman physicians even wrote guides on the best techniques for productive vomiting. Celsus, a first-century medical writer, recommended certain foods that were easier to bring back up. Galen discussed the health benefits of controlled purging. This wasn't considered disgusting. It was considered refined, civilized, the mark of someone who knew how to properly enjoy life's pleasures. And this was just dinner parties. Imagine what they did during actual celebrations. Now we go from weird to genuinely disturbing. After gladiatorial combat ended and bodies were dragged from the arena, vendors would rush in with cups, bowls, and containers. They weren't cleaning up, they were collecting blood. Fresh, warm gladiator blood was considered one of the most powerful medicines in ancient Rome. Specifically, it was believed to cure epilepsy. This wasn't fringe pseudoscience. This was mainstream Roman medicine, documented by their most respected scholars. Pliny the Elder, one of Rome's greatest historians and naturalists, wrote extensively about this practice in his encyclopedia, Natural History. He described epileptic Romans sprinting into the arena the moment a gladiator fell, pushing through crowds to drink blood directly from the wounds while the body was still warm. The belief was that the life force, the vitality, the warrior spirit of the gladiator could be transferred through the blood. The fresher, the better, the more violent the death, the more potent the medicine. Some Romans would pay premium prices to drink blood from gladiators who were still alive but mortally wounded. Merchants would hold dying gladiators down while customers gulped from cups pressed to gushing wounds. If you couldn't afford fresh blood or weren't fast enough to get to the arena, you could buy it preserved. Vendors sold dried gladiator blood in powder form. You'd mix it with wine and drink it as a tonic. There was an entire black market around this. Blood from particularly famous gladiators commanded higher prices. Blood from virgins who died in the arena was considered especially powerful. Blood from criminals executed in creative ways had different supposed properties than blood from honorable combat. This practice continued for centuries. Early Christian martyrs thrown to lions or killed in the arena had their blood collected the same way. Ironically, some of that blood was later venerated as holy relics by the very religion that opposed the practice. The Emperor Constantine finally banned gladiatorial combat in 325 AD, partly due to Christian influence. But the blood trade continued underground for decades afterward. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Excavations around amphitheaters have found hundreds of small cups and vials with traces of human blood, often buried near arena entrances where vendors would have set up shop. Roman physicians genuinely believed this worked. They wrote case studies. They prescribed specific dosages. They debated whether gladiator blood was more effective than blood from soldiers killed in battle. Modern analysis suggests that any perceived benefits were pure placebo effect, possibly combined with iron supplementation from consuming blood. But for Romans, this was as normal as buying aspirin at a pharmacy. The arena wasn't just entertainment, it was a pharmacy, a hospital, a source of miracle cures, and the most prized medicine came from dying men. Everyone's heard the story about Emperor Caligula threatening to make his horse a consul. Most people think it's an exaggeration, a joke that got out of hand. Historical gossip. Nope, he actually did it. The horse's name was Incitatus, which ironically means swift or at full gallop in Latin, and Incitatus wasn't just any horse. This animal lived better than 99% of Romans. Caligula had a mansion built specifically for Incitatus, not a stable, a mansion with marble walls, a separate wing for the horse's personal staff, and fixtures that would make modern luxury hotels jealous. The stable itself was made of marble. The stall had ivory railings. The manger where the horse ate was carved ivory inlaid with precious stones. The feed trough was solid gold. Incitatus had 18 personal servants, 18 human beings whose full-time job was caring for one horse. Groomers, feeders, trainers, guards, and even a dedicated storyteller whose job was to keep the horse entertained. The horse drank wine from golden goblets, not water from a bucket. Wine, expensive wine, the same quality served at imperial banquets. Incitatus slept under purple blankets. In Rome, the color purple was restricted by law. Only emperors and the highest senators could wear Tyrian purple, made from thousands of crushed murex sea snails. Each gram cost more than gold, and Caligula's horse slept wrapped in it. But here's where it gets truly insane. Roman historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades after Caligula's death, both confirm that Caligula didn't just pamper his horse, he elevated it politically. Caligula invited Incitatus to dinner parties. At the imperial palace, the horse would be led into the dining hall, given his own couch, and served alongside human guests. Senators were forced to make small talk with a horse, while slaves fed it oats from golden plates. Caligula introduced legislation in the Senate chambers and claimed it was at Incitatus's suggestion. He would lean down, pretend to listen to the horse whisper in his ear, then announce policy changes recommended by Consul Incitatus, and yes, he did formally nominate the horse for consul, one of the two highest political offices in Rome. The Senate couldn't refuse without openly defying the emperor. Some sources suggest the nomination went through, though Caligula was assassinated before Incitatus could officially serve. Now, was Caligula genuinely insane, or was this a calculated political move? Modern historians lean toward the latter. Caligula despised the Senate. He thought they were useless, corrupt, and less intelligent than livestock. By elevating his horse to their level, he wasn't just insulting them. He was making a philosophical statement. This animal has as much value in government as you do. It was performance art, political satire, a middle finger to the aristocracy wrapped in the trappings of imperial power. But whether he was crazy or calculated, the result was the same. For years, a horse held more political power than most Roman citizens, and the Senate had to sit there and take it. Let's talk about urine, not because it's gross, but because in ancient Rome, urine was big business, like tax revenue generating, economic pillar of society big business. The professional launderers of Rome were called fullones. They ran shops called fullonici, and outside every single one of these shops stood giant ceramic vats. These weren't decorations. Every morning, men would line up to urinate in these vats. This was a civic duty, a contribution to society. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, and ammonia is one of the most effective natural cleaning and bleaching agents in existence. Roman togas had to be pristine white, bright, almost glowing white. It was a status symbol, a sign of citizenship. Wealthy Romans would rather die than be seen in a dingy, yellowed toga. But Roman togas were made of wool, heavy, thick wool that would take forever to wash with just water and soap. So fullones developed a process. They'd collect urine from public vats, let it age for days or weeks until the ammonia concentration increased. Then they'd pour the clothes into these giant stone basins filled with stale urine. Workers would climb in barefoot and stomp on the togas for hours, exactly like stomping grapes for wine. In fact, the same kind of rhythmic movements, sometimes with workers singing songs to keep pace. The ammonia would break down oils, sweat, and stains. The stomping would work the liquid deep into the fibers. After hours of this, they'd rinse the togas in fresh water, stretch them on frames, and treat them with sulfur fumes to make them even whiter. The results were spectacular. Togas came out brighter than modern bleach could achieve. This process was so important, so economically valuable, that Emperor Nero instituted a urine tax. That's right, a tax on piss. Fullones had to pay the government for the privilege of collecting urine, and they passed that cost on to customers. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices for professionally cleaned togas, and part of that price was literally a piss tax. Emperor Vespasian made this tax official and permanent. When his son Titus complained that it was disgusting to tax urine, Vespasian held up a gold coin and asked, "Does this smell bad to you?" Titus admitted it didn't. Vespasian replied with one of history's most famous quotes, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't stink. That phrase is still used today to mean that the source of money doesn't matter, only its value. But wait, it gets worse. Some Romans rinsed their mouths with old urine. Yes, as mouthwash. The same ammonia that bleached togas white would also bleach teeth white. Roman medical texts recommend it. Poets made fun of people who did it. Catullus, one of Rome's most famous poets, wrote insulting verses mocking a rival for having teeth so white you must drink Portuguese piss. This wasn't universal. Plenty of Romans thought it was disgusting, but enough people did it that it became a cultural touchstone, the kind of thing satirists could reference and everyone would understand. The urine economy lasted for centuries. When archaeologists excavate Roman laundry shops, they still find the massive stone basins with channels carved for liquid drainage. Chemical analysis of residue confirms it. Urine, ammonia, and traces of ancient Roman sweat. So, the next time you hear someone romanticize ancient Rome, remember this. Their sparkling white togas, the symbol of civilization and refinement, washed in piss. By people who stomped on your clothes with their bare feet, after soaking them in aged urine that had been fermenting in a street-side vat that random strangers peed in every morning. Civilization has layers. Everyone knows about Pompeii. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. The city was buried in ash. People were frozen in time. It's tragic, it's fascinating, and it's one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. But what they don't teach you in school is just how apocalyptically violent this eruption actually was. October 24th, 79 AD, early afternoon. Mount Vesuvius explodes with a force 100,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 100,000 times. The column of ash, rock, and gas shot 33 kilometers into the atmosphere. That's twice the height modern commercial aircraft fly. The column was visible from Rome, 250 kilometers away. But here's what killed everyone. It wasn't the ash. It wasn't suffocation. It was the pyroclastic surges. Imagine a wall of superheated gas and volcanic matter racing down the mountain at 700 kilometers per hour. Faster than a commercial jet. Faster than you can blink. Faster than you can think. And the temperature? 900 degrees Celsius. For reference, water boils at 100 degrees. Wood ignites at around 300. The human body is 70% water. When that wall of heat hit Pompeii, people didn't burn to death. They didn't suffocate. They vaporized. In less than 1/10 of a second, the water in their bodies flash-boiled. Their soft tissues turned to ash. Their brains boiled inside their skulls. Then the ash and debris poured over them, creating perfect molds of their final moments. Those famous Pompeii body casts, the ones in museums showing people frozen mid-scream, those aren't bodies. Those are the empty spaces where bodies used to be. Archaeologists pour plaster into the voids left when the flesh disintegrated. What you're seeing is a 3-dimensional photograph in volcanic ash of someone's last microsecond of life. In 2018, archaeologists found something even more disturbing. A man's skeleton with the skull completely shattered from the inside. What happened? His brain boiled so fast that the expanding steam pressure exploded his head from within. The force was so intense that pieces of his skull were found embedded in the walls several meters away. Vesuvius didn't just kill, it obliterated. The first surge hit at around 6:30 in the evening. It killed everyone who was still in the city instantly. The second surge hit around midnight. The third at 7:30 in the morning the next morning. Each surge buried the city deeper. Each one was hundreds of degrees hot. Each one moved faster than any human could run. Some people tried to hide in buildings. The heat collapsed their lungs before the structures even fell. Some tried to flee to the beach, hoping to escape by boat. They were cooked alive on the sand, their bodies baked into hardened shells of ash. Approximately 16,000 people died across Pompeii and neighboring Herculaneum. Not one of them had time to feel pain. The eruption was so sudden, so overwhelming, that it caught people mid-task. There's a body of a man still clutching his money bag, a dog still chained to a post, trying to climb higher as the ash rose, a group frozen at a dinner table. One of the most haunting discoveries? A pregnant woman. The plaster cast shows her on her back, one hand on her belly, the other reaching upward. Modern volcanologists study Vesuvius obsessively because it's still active. 3 million people live in the Naples metropolitan area surrounding the volcano. When, not if, it erupts again, it will likely be just as catastrophic. But here's the thing about Pompeii that makes it so valuable to historians. Because the city was flash frozen in time, we know more about daily Roman life from Pompeii than from any other source. The graffiti on the walls, the food still on tables, the tools in workshops, the obscene drawings in bathrooms, the personal items in bedrooms. Pompeii wasn't a museum, it was a living city, preserved at the exact moment of its destruction. And what it reveals is both beautiful and disturbing, which brings us to our next fact. Emperor Augustus, the first true Roman emperor, had a slave whose only job was to stand behind him during victory parades and whisper in his ear. The phrase, memento mori, remember, you are mortal. This wasn't cruelty. It was supposed to be wisdom, a reminder that no matter how great the triumph, the emperor was still human. But that's actually one of the normal imperial slave jobs. Let me tell you about the weird ones. Emperors had slaves called nomenclators. Their job? Memorize thousands of names. Imagine being at a public event where 10,000 people show up. The emperor needs to work the crowd, greet important people, and remember everyone's name to avoid insulting them. Impossible, right? That's where the nomenclator comes in. These slaves would stand slightly behind and to the side of the emperor. As people approached, the nomenclator would whisper their name, title, family connections, and relevant recent events directly into the emperor's ear. To the crowd, it looked like the emperor had a superhuman memory. In reality, there was an invisible human Rolodex feeding him information in real time. Some nomenclators could remember 10, 20, even 30,000 names and faces. They were trained from childhood, exposed to artwork, sculpture, and public events constantly. They'd memorize family trees going back generations. They knew which senators hated each other, who was sleeping with whom, who had financial troubles. One wrong whisper could result in a political disaster, or the slave's execution. Then there were the Lordicini, applause counters. Emperor Domitian was so paranoid and narcissistic that he had a slave whose sole job was to count how many times people applauded during his speeches. Not estimate, count exactly. This slave would stand in the crowd with a wax tablet, making tally marks every time applause broke out. At the end of the speech, he'd report the exact number to Domitian. If the number was lower than last time, Domitian would demand to know why. Were people less enthusiastic? Was someone plotting against him? Should heads roll? Some emperors had food tasters, which makes sense. Poisoning was a real threat. But did you know some emperors had up to 30 food tasters? Not because one wasn't enough, but because different tasters specialized in different types of poison. One taster for plant-based poisons, one for mineral poisons, one for animal venoms, one for substances that might be slow-acting, one for substances that only affected specific organs. These slaves lived in constant terror because if poison got through, they died first. But if they refused to taste something, they'd be executed for disobedience. There were also cubiculari, bedroom slaves. Their job was to dress the emperor, undress the emperor, manage the emperor's wardrobe, and ensure privacy during intimate moments. But some went further. Some emperors, notably Nero, had slaves whose job was to arrange and participate in increasingly bizarre sexual scenarios. We're talking about human props, living furniture, orchestrated debauchery that required professional coordination. There were also imperial barbers who didn't just cut hair, they were confidants. They heard every secret whispered during grooming sessions. Some became incredibly powerful because they knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. And then there were the villicus, estate managers who supervised hundreds of other slaves. These were slaves who owned slaves in a weird hierarchical system that only Romans could create. The point is this: being an imperial slave wasn't like being a field slave or a mine slave. Imperial slaves lived in luxury, ate well, wore fine clothes, and had significant power, but they were still property. They could be killed on a whim, tortured for mistakes, sold if they fell out of favor. Some emperors freed their favorite slaves, who then became wealthy Roman citizens. Others kept them in gilded cages for entire lifetimes. The Roman relationship with slavery was deeply complex, deeply hypocritical, and utterly alien to modern sensibilities. Let's go back to Pompeii for a moment. When archaeologists first excavated the city in the 1700s, they found something that shocked them so badly they built a secret room in the Naples Archaeological Museum called the Secret Cabinet. For over 100 years, only adult men of good moral character were allowed to enter. What was inside? Pornography, ancient Roman pornography, everywhere. See, Pompeii wasn't just bakeries, temples, and respectable homes. They found an entire brothel, a building called the Lupanar, which literally means wolf den because prostitutes were called she-wolves. The brothel had 10 rooms, stone beds with no mattresses, and on the walls, detailed frescoes showing explicit sexual acts in graphic detail. These weren't hidden. They were right there on the walls, like a menu. Customers could point to the fresco showing what they wanted. Language barrier? No problem. Just point to the picture. The images showed every position, every combination, every variation imaginable. Men with women, men with men, women with women, multiple partners, positions that look anatomically challenging. But the pornography wasn't limited to brothels. Across Pompeii, in regular homes, businesses, and public spaces, there were flying penises, not metaphorical, literal carved and painted penises with wings. These were called fascinum. They were good luck charms, protection against evil spirits, a symbol of Fascinus, a divine phallus deity that Romans believed warded off curses. A bakery had a massive stone phallus pointing toward the oven with an inscription, Hic habitat felicitas, here dwells happiness. Wealthy homes had phallic wind chimes called tintinnabulum hanging in doorways. When wind blew, bronze penises would clink together. Blacksmiths wore penis-shaped amulets for good luck at work. Rich women wore jewelry shaped like erect penises, not hidden under clothes, openly, at dinner parties, at public events. It gets weirder. In one Pompeii home, they found a fresco of the god Priapus weighing his enormous erect penis against a bag of gold coins on a scale. The penis was winning. This wasn't shameful. This wasn't hidden. This was normal Roman culture. Roman religion was deeply connected to fertility, masculinity, and sexual potency. The phallus represented life force, creative power, and divine protection. When early archaeologists found this stuff, they were so scandalized they either reburied it, destroyed it, or locked it away. Victorian scholars literally smashed priceless ancient artifacts because they couldn't handle the sexual content. It wasn't until 2000 that the secret cabinet was finally opened to the general public without restrictions. And it wasn't until 2012 that archaeologists started properly cataloging and studying these artifacts without moral judgment. What they've learned is fascinating. Romans didn't have the same sexual taboos as later Christian Europe. They didn't see sex as inherently sinful or shameful. They did have rules. Strict rules about who could do what with whom. Social status mattered enormously. A Roman citizen man could do almost anything with slaves or prostitutes, but there were severe penalties for adultery with another citizen's wife. But the visual representation of sex, that was everywhere, public, celebrated. Pompeii reveals the Romans as they actually were, not the sanitized marble statues in museums, but real people with complex, often contradictory attitudes about sexuality, power, religion, and daily life. The gladiatorial games are famous. Everyone knows about men fighting to the death in the arena. But the animal spectacles? Those were somehow even more insane. Emperor Claudius once organized a naumachia, a staged naval battle in a flooded arena. Thousands of criminals and prisoners of war fought to the death in ships while the crowd watched. But during one naumachia, Claudius released a whale into the water. Not a small whale. A massive cetacean that had gotten trapped in the harbor. Claudius himself went into the arena with a harpoon and killed it while soldiers in boats fought around him. The crowd went absolutely insane. Emperor Nero took things further. He once had handlers sew a bull and a bear together and forced them to fight each other while bound. Imagine the logistics of that. Imagine the cruelty. Imagine being in the crowd, watching two massive animals, stitched together, tearing at each other in confused agony. The crowd loved it. Emperor Commodus fought in the arena 735 times. 735. But here's the thing, he never fought anyone who could actually hurt him. He fought disabled opponents, unarmed criminals, exhausted gladiators who'd already fought 3 matches, wild animals with clipped claws and filed down teeth. He once fought 100 bears in a single day, except the bears were chained down and couldn't move. Commodus just walked around shooting them with arrows. He declared himself Hercules reborn and fought in a lion's skin. He killed ostriches with special crescent-shaped arrows designed to decapitate them. One ancient account describes Commodus bringing the heads of decapitated ostriches to the Senate and waving them at senators as a threat. The message? This could be you. The scale of animal slaughter in Roman arenas is almost incomprehensible. For the inauguration of the Flavian Amphitheater, later called the Colosseum, Emperor Titus held games lasting 100 days. 9,000 animals were killed. 9,000. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, giraffes, leopards, crocodiles, ostriches, bulls, and animals from across the empire. There were venaciones, professional animal hunters who fought wild beasts. Some became as famous as gladiators. There were damnatio ad bestias, executions where criminals were fed to wild animals as entertainment. These weren't quick deaths. Romans wanted drama. They'd starve the animals for days. They'd torture the condemned to make them bleed so the smell would drive the animals wild. Sometimes they'd dress criminals as mythological figures. Someone condemned would be tied to a post dressed as Prometheus, then eagles would be released to tear at them. Someone else would be dressed as Orpheus, then lions would be released. It was execution as theater, death as entertainment, cruelty as art. By the end of the Roman Empire, several species were driven to regional extinction. North African elephants, gone from the wild. Atlas lions, extinct. The Romans hunted them to death for entertainment. And here's the darkest part. This wasn't rare. This wasn't special events. This was regular entertainment. Multiple times per week in major cities. Smaller shows in provincial towns. Romans would bring their children to watch. They'd eat snacks while people and animals died in front of them. It was normalized violence on a scale that's hard for modern people to comprehend. We need to talk about the tunica molesta, the troublesome tunic or annoying shirt. This was a method of execution so cruel that even hardened Romans found it disturbing. For certain crimes, particularly treason or, later, religious crimes like refusing to worship Roman gods, the condemned would be dressed in a special tunic. This tunic was made of papyrus or cheap cloth soaked in pitch, resin, wax, and other flammable materials. Then they'd be tied to a post or stake and set on fire. The victim would burn alive, slowly, as the tunic turned them into a human torch. Emperor Nero used this method on a massive scale. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Nero needed scapegoats. He blamed Christians, who were already unpopular. He had hundreds, possibly thousands of Christians arrested. Some were fed to wild animals in the arena. Some were crucified. But some were dressed in the tunica molesta and burned alive at Nero's garden parties. According to the historian Tacitus, Nero would use these human torches to light his gardens at night while he hosted feasts. Guests would eat, drink, and socialize while people burned to death as ambient lighting. Some accounts say Nero would drive his chariot through the gardens, illuminated by the dying. Even Romans who hated Christians found this excessive. Tacitus, no friend to Christians, wrote that this cruelty generated sympathy for the victims because it seemed not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's sadism. The tunica molesta wasn't unique to Nero, though he's the most famous user of it. It was a recognized execution method for centuries, particularly in provinces where examples needed to be made. The logic was deterrence through horror. Make the execution so terrible that others wouldn't dare commit the same crime. Did it work? Not really. Christianity continued to spread despite, and perhaps because of, these persecutions. Martyrdom became central to Christian identity precisely because of spectacles like this. The image of faithful believers dying horribly rather than renouncing their beliefs was powerful propaganda. But from a purely historical perspective, the tunica molesta represents something important about Roman culture. Romans had very different ideas about cruelty, justice, and public spectacle than modern societies do. They believed in proportional punishment, but their scale was different. They believed in public executions as deterrence and as entertainment. And they had the engineering expertise and logistical capability to implement these beliefs at scale. Rome was simultaneously the most advanced and most brutal civilization in ancient history. That's not a contradiction. That's just Rome. Here's something they definitely didn't teach you in school. Female gladiators existed. They fought in the arena. They killed and died for public entertainment. For decades, historians dismissed accounts of female gladiators as exaggeration or fantasy. Then in 2000, archaeologists in London found a skeleton, female, late 20s or early 30s, buried with gladiatorial equipment, victory medals, and a pelvis shattered from repeated blunt force trauma consistent with arena combat. This was definitive proof, and once archaeologists knew what to look for, they found more evidence, reliefs and statues depicting female fighters, inscriptions mentioning gladiatrix by name, literary references that suddenly made sense. Female gladiators fought differently than men. They typically fought topless or in minimal clothing, but not for the reasons you might think. Romans believed that seeing a woman's hair and face was important. The anonymity of a helmet ruined the spectacle. The crowd wanted to see expressions, fear, determination. This wasn't about sexuality, necessarily. It was about the novelty and transgression. Roman society had strict gender roles. Women, especially upper-class women, were expected to be modest, domestic, and submissive. Seeing women in combat, wielding swords, killing opponents, this was shocking. Taboo, thrilling, female gladiators drew massive crowds. Some accounts suggest they were more popular than male gladiators, at least as novelty acts. Emperor Septimius Severus eventually banned female gladiators in 200 AD because crowds were going too wild for them. The ban suggests they'd become common enough to be a social problem. Who became female gladiators? Some were slaves with no choice, some were criminals sentenced to the arena, but some were volunteers. Roman law allowed free women to voluntarily enter gladiatorial schools and fight for money and fame. This was considered deeply shameful by elite Romans, but it happened. Why would a free woman choose this? Money, fame, escape from poverty or bad marriages, the thrill, the same reasons men did it. One inscription mentions a woman named Amazonia, who fought another female gladiator named Achillea. Both were granted their freedom after the match, suggesting they'd earned enough respect and popularity to be released from service. Female gladiators trained in the same schools as men. They learned the same techniques. They used the same weapons, though sometimes lighter versions. They fought other women, not men. Romans found the idea of mixed-gender combat inappropriate, even in the arena. The ban, in 200 AD, didn't end the practice immediately. Provincial arenas continued featuring female fighters for years. Some sources mention female gladiators as late as the 4th century. But as Christianity became more influential, the entire gladiatorial system began to collapse. Gladiatorial combat was seen as barbaric, pagan, and incompatible with Christian values. The last recorded gladiatorial combat occurred in 404 AD, when a Christian monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the angry crowd. Emperor Honorius used this as justification to permanently ban gladiatorial games. But for centuries before that, women fought and died in the sand alongside men. Their stories were forgotten, dismissed, erased from history, until archaeologists started digging and found the proof. The Western Roman Empire didn't collapse in 476 AD because of barbarian invasions. That's the simplified version they teach in school. The truth? Rome was already dead inside. Let me explain. By the late 4th century, the Roman tax system was insane. Historians estimate tax rates reached 80 to 90% in some provinces. 90%. Imagine working all year and the government taking almost everything you produce. Farmers abandoned their land because it wasn't worth farming. Cities depended on grain from Egypt and North Africa, but the supply chains were breaking down. Then there was the currency crisis. Roman silver coins in the 1st century were 95% pure silver. By the 3rd century, they were 5% silver, 95% copper, and other trash metals. The government kept minting coins with the same face value but less and less actual precious metal. This caused massive inflation. A loaf of bread that cost 1 coin in 200 AD cost 5,000 coins by 300 AD. People lost faith in money entirely. They went back to bartering. The sophisticated Roman economy collapsed into medieval-level trade. The population crashed. At its peak, the Roman Empire had 70 million people. By the 5th century, it was down to 20 million. 20 million. Where did everyone go? Disease, famine, war, economic collapse. People stopped having children because they couldn't afford to feed them. The army was a shadow of its former self. Rome couldn't recruit enough citizens, so they hired barbarian mercenaries, Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns. They paid them to defend the borders. But here's the problem. Why would these mercenaries keep fighting for Rome when they could just take what they wanted? And that's exactly what happened. In 410 AD, Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome. The first time the city had fallen to an enemy in 800 years. In 455 AD, Vandals sacked Rome again. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was a joke. The emperor was a 16-year-old kid named Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, named after the founder of Rome. Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. He was a puppet. He had no real power, no army, no money, no legitimacy. The barbarian general Odoacer walked in, deposed him, and instead of declaring himself emperor, he just sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople and said, "We don't need a Western emperor anymore." And that was it. No epic final battle, no dramatic last stand. Just a teenager given a pension and sent off to retire in a villa. The fall of Rome wasn't a collapse. It was a slow decay, a long decline, a civilization that ate itself from the inside until there was nothing left but the shell. And here's the darkest irony. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years. They kept Roman law, Roman culture, Roman identity alive in Constantinople. They watched the West fall and thought, we're the real Romans now. And they were right. So what killed Rome? Taxes, inflation, corruption, military weakness, loss of civic identity, economic collapse, environmental degradation from centuries of deforestation and soil depletion, lead poisoning from water pipes, political instability, 26 different emperors in 50 years during the 3rd century crisis. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. Rome died the way all civilizations die. Slowly, then all at once. But here's what's wild. We're still living in Rome's shadow. Our legal systems, Roman law, our languages, Latin derivatives, our architecture, Roman designs, our government structures, inspired by the Roman Republic. Our calendar, created by Julius Caesar. The very concept of Western civilization traces back to Rome. So there you have it. Ancient Rome, the greatest civilization in history, built on madness, genius, cruelty, and absolute chaos. They conquered the world but couldn't conquer themselves. They built monuments that lasted millennia but couldn't build a sustainable society. They gave us law and order while wallowing in systematic brutality. They were sophisticated enough to engineer aqueducts and stupid enough to wash their clothes in piss. They were brilliant enough to create representative government and insane enough to let a horse hold political office. They cured diseases with gladiator blood, turned executions into entertainment, and made an industry out of collecting urine. They built an empire on the backs of millions of slaves while simultaneously creating philosophical traditions about human dignity and natural rights. They were hypocrites, monsters, geniuses, savages. They were human, and maybe that's the real lesson here. Civilization is fragile. Progress isn't inevitable. The most advanced society can still be capable of unthinkable cruelty. The Romans thought they were eternal. They called the Mediterranean our sea. They believed their empire would last forever. It didn't. Nothing does. But the stories survive. The archaeology survives. The lessons survive. And those 15 insane facts you just learned, they're all 100% historically verified, documented by Roman writers, confirmed by modern archaeology, supported by physical evidence. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't exaggeration. This was daily life in ancient Rome. So which fact shocked you the most? Was it the vomit feasts, the gladiator blood medicine, the horse consul, the urine economy, the Vesuvius horror, the bizarre imperial slaves, the pornographic city, the insane animal spectacles, the human torches, the female gladiators, the economic collapse? Drop it in the comments right now. And if this video hits 100,000 likes, I'll drop part 2, the insane sex lives of Roman emperors. Trust me, it gets way darker. We're talking about Caligula's sister, Nero's mother, Elagabalus's gender experimentation, Tiberius's island of depravity, Messalina's sex competitions. The rabbit hole goes deep. Smash that subscribe button, turn on notifications. Because Roman history is an endless gold mine of absolutely unhinged stories that they never taught you in school. Until next time, remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it sure fell apart pretty quickly once it started. See you in the next one.